Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Dunkley.
Marion from Carrum Downs called my office furious when she heard the Prime Minister say the vaccination rollout was not a race. For Marion, it's a race. It's a race to see her husband again in aged care. It's a race to protect herself after her battle with breast cancer. Why has the Prime Minister failed Australians like Marion with his vaccine rollout?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd be very pleased to receive further details so we can extend our care and support to the constituent that you've referred to, as she particularly is facing these difficult days ahead with her treatment as cancer sufferers around the country, Mr. Speaker. This is a very difficult time, no doubt, for them, and as these other issues are impacting the nation, I can understand how that can add further distress, Mr. Speaker. It is very important that we move as quickly as we possibly can and as effectively and as safely as we can to vaccinate as many Australians as possible, Mr. Speaker. As quickly as possible. That is the comments that I've said, Mr. Speaker. It's those that our health advisors have said also. Mr. Speaker, today we received the news that over 700,000 Australians have been vaccinated in the past week. Over 130,000 Australians in one day, Mr. Speaker. They are record numbers again. Mr. Speaker, in the course of the past month, the rate of vaccination in this country amongst eligible Australians has increased by over 100%, Mr. Speaker. It's doubled. It's doubled in the course of the past month. Some 2 million in the first 66 days, Mr. Speaker, a further 2 million in the next 30 days. And the changes that were introduced as I drew National Cabinet together, Mr. Speaker, back in April to put the plan in place, Mr. Speaker, that ensured that we increased the vaccination rates in this country has been effective, because we've seen the vaccination rates double, Mr. Speaker, over the course of the past month. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is important for all Australians to roll up their sleeve on this project, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing more and more Australians roll up their sleeve. Mr. Speaker, the state premiers, together with the chief ministers and myself, the members of my government, Mr. Speaker, those right across the country. The member for Paterson will resume her seat. Mr. Speaker, it is incredibly important. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. I asked the member for Paterson to leave under Standing Order 94A. On her way out, she interjected yet again. Does she know that that is highly disorderly and usually results in a naming? Does the member for Paterson wish to apologise to the House?
I apologise, Mr. Speaker, wholeheartedly.
And you can now leave under 94A. That is the last time I will do that. I'm very happy later in question time, if this arises again, to explain the practice and to explain how I've been lenient on that occasion. I've done that so as not to disturb question time for the vast bulk of members who aren't interjecting, but I'll have no choice if members think they can backchat the chair on the way out. It's not going to happen. It's disrespectful to the rest of you, and it's unbecoming of an elected member of Parliament. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we must move forward quickly and effectively and safely, Mr. Speaker. The remarks that I have made on this matter back in March, Mr. Speaker, reflected the remarks made by Queensland Health when they said on the 3rd of March this is not a race. The AMA President on the 10th of April, it is not a race to the finish line, Mr. Speaker, and the 10th of March by Professor Murphy. Professor Murphy, Mr. Speaker, with whom I wholeheartedly agree, Mr. Speaker, made further comments yesterday which I also agree with. So, Mr. Speaker, rather than the opposition getting into arguments about words, Mr. Speaker, perhaps they'd like to support the government. Support the government,
Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business. Members on my rights. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr. Speaker, this is about a woman wanting to be able to see her husband again, who is a cancer survivor. And for that to be ridiculed as being an objection about words is offensive and irrelevant to the question that was asked.
Members on both sides. The Prime Minister has the call. I'm giving the...
Mr Speaker, I reject what the member incoming the dispatch box. I was referring to the comments about a race, Mr Speaker. I already extended my great sympathies, Mr Speaker, to the constituent in question, as the member should know. Mr Speaker, the opposition can continue to play politics with the vaccination program, or they can support the national effort. Over the course of this pandemic, Mr Speaker, the opposition has sought to play politics with the pandemic, and they should be ashamed of that, Mr Speaker. We will get on with it.
The member for Herbert.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please inform the House how the Morrison government is setting their foundation for our continued economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic by creating a safer and more secure Australia?
The Prime Minister has the...
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the battle against COVID-19 continues, as those particularly in Victoria will know, and with the disappointing news that has been announced today. But Victoria and Australia will continue to overcome, as we have throughout the course of the pandemic. And as I referred to in my earlier answer, Mr Speaker, the fact we've had 700,000 vaccinations in the past week is a great indication of the way that Australians are rallying together around this program to ensure that Australians can be as safe as we possibly can be. But, Mr Speaker, just as we have prevailed on occasions before, so the National Accounts data today, Mr Speaker, shows how Australia's resilience and Australia's recovery is certainly underway. We have an economy today, Mr Speaker, that is bigger today than it was before the pandemic hit. Mr Speaker, not only have we now got employment at a level higher than when the pandemic hit, but after the shocking blow of the pandemic and the pandemic recession it has caused, Mr Speaker, in the course of 1 year, in the course of just 1 year, Mr Speaker, we now have an economy that is bigger today than it was before the pandemic, and more people in work today than before the pandemic began, Mr Speaker. And as the Treasurer, I'm sure, Mr Speaker, has already noted, this is a result in the national accounts that means this is an Australians-led recovery, Mr Speaker. In the data we see the performance on households, families, in their households and their consumption and believing in their economic future and taking decisions to support Australia. We have seen it in Australians building homes at record levels in the dwelling investment figures, Mr Speaker, supported by the Home Builder program. And we've seen it with businesses investing, Mr Speaker. A business-led economy has been the outcome sought by our policies to restore growth in the Australian economy, ensure that our growth in the economy can continue into the future, Mr Speaker. It shows that our plan is working. The Australia's recovery plan set out by the Treasurer in the budget this year and indeed in last year's budget, Mr Speaker, shows that our plan is working to restore the Australian economy, and we've already seen our economy grow to levels higher than it was before the pandemic hit. But it's not the only threat we face, Mr Speaker. It's not the only threat we face in terms of the pandemic. We will continue to remain focused on our national security and our regional security. And the upcoming meetings, Mr Speaker, in the G7 overseas will be important opportunities, and visiting Singapore on the way, Mr Speaker, to engage with one of our most important ASEAN partners to secure our regional relationships and to secure our broader international relationships, which are so important to Australia's national security. I mentioned yesterday, Mr Speaker, that I've been able to stand with the New Zealand Prime Minister and we are on the same page on our national issues and national security. I hope the Leader of the Opposition can stand on the same page.
The member for Ballarat has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. At an aged care home in my electorate, 5 residents missed out on their first dose of COVID vaccine because federal government contractors arrived without enough doses. The residents were told to go to a GP clinic to get them, but the residents are frail and immobile. Why on earth is the government telling people who are frail and immobile to find their way to a local GP clinic for their vaccine?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very pleased to respond to the member for Ballarat. I'd be pleased and grateful to receive the details of the facility. In particular, what we know that across Victoria, all facilities have received a first dose. We currently have 50 in-reach clinics which are being conducted this week for any facilities where there are residents who have, within that facility not received a first dose, we would be very happy, as we are right through all of these, to ensure that those residents are scheduled. I can't speak for what was said to them on the time. I can say that our program is to ensure that there is in reach, over and above that which has already occurred. 100% of Commonwealth residential aged care facilities within Victoria have received a first dose. And so we now currently have the next phase, both of delivering the second doses to all facilities, and if they did not receive a dose on the first round, they would be entitled to receive it.
Member for Ballarat.
They would be entitled to receive it on the second. And if that is not the case, then there is also the additional program, which is in relation to that, of the roving clinics which are being provided. There are 50 such mobile clinics which are occurring inside facilities on my advice this week.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House about how the Morrison government's plan to secure our economic recovery is ensuring Australia leads the global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her work in the not-for-profit sector before she came to this place. And I had the opportunity to recently join the member for Lindsay in Penrith to meet with businesses who are using the immediate expensing provisions in this year's budget to help employ more Australians and to grow their business. Now, Mr Speaker, today's national accounts show that the Australian economy is leading the world, Mr Speaker, is leading the world, with the March quarter seeing GDP growth of 1.8%, beating market expectations of 1.5%, Mr Speaker, beating market expectations of 1.5%. And what we saw in today's numbers was a broad-based recovery, a private sector-led recovery, with household consumption being up, with dwelling investment being up, with business investment being up, with machinery and equipment being up. Now, Mr Speaker, over the March quarter, we saw the British economy contract. We saw the French economy contract. We saw the German economy contract. We saw the Japanese economy contract, but we saw the Australian economy expand, Mr Speaker. We saw the Australian economy expand. And now, with today's national accounts numbers, we know that the Australian economy is today bigger than it was going into the pandemic, Mr Speaker. Bigger than it was going into the pandemic. Ahead of any major advanced economy around the world. So we recently saw employment in Australia now higher than it was pre-pandemic, ahead of any major advanced economy in the world. And today we saw that GDP growth is now ahead of any major advanced economy in the world. Mr Speaker, today, and I know the regional members on this side of the House will be interested in this, we have seen through the year farm GDP more than 38% higher, the best numbers through the year in 17 years, Mr Speaker. That is more jobs. That is more export income, Mr Speaker. That is a stronger economy. And we saw in today's numbers dwelling investment up by more than 6%, the strongest numbers in 17 years, Mr Speaker, because of Home Builder, which has helped support more than $30 billion of residential economic activity, Mr Speaker, with more than 130,000 applications. This side of the House is focused on more jobs. This side of the House is focused on lower taxes. This side of the House is delivering a stronger economy.
The member for Sydney. Now, just before I call the next question out, I'm just going to remind members, if you interject, you'll be ejected. I shouldn't have to do this every day, but I'm going to point out, whilst there's been a large number of ejections, they relate to a very small number of people who are continual offenders. So some of them are looking at me quite closely now. So let's have no surprise about this. let's have none of the social media nonsense about I got ejected because I was standing up for X, Y and Z. You got ejected because you're breaking the standing orders. That's really, really clear. And if you need me to start pointing out who's been ejected, how many times, I'm happy to do it for the benefit of your electorates. I believe in a lot of transparency. The member for Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. At an aged care facility in my electorate, staff were notified they would be given vaccinations this week by a government contractor. But just minutes after this notification, the vaccinations were cancelled and the facility advised it was not considered to be a sufficient risk. When aged care workers haven't been vaccinated, why does the Prime Minister still say it's not a race?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and to the member for Jagga, I'd be pleased to receive the details of which particular facility. There was a case yesterday where the member for Isaacs raised a facility and it did turn out not to be a Commonwealth facility. However, we would be very much keen to receive the details, to understand the circumstances and to ensure that the details are available. I will say in relation to InReach for aged care workers that at this point in time over 40,000 workers, 17.3% of Commonwealth aged care workers have received doses on a first basis, and of those 34,390 have received second doses. So there is a significant program. There are 4 additional channels that are available for those workers. The first, of course, is in relation to the general practice InReach program. The second is in relation to the ability to be vaccinated at general practices. The third is in relation to the ability to be vaccinated at Commonwealth GP respiratory clinics or Commonwealth clinics. The fourth is in relation to state and territory Pfizer clinics, and that was a decision of the National Cabinet, I believe, Prime Minister, on the 22nd of April, which has been adopted by the majority of states and territories, and one has added to that in the last 24 hours, we understand. And then finally, of course, there is the InReach program itself, which has seen well over 70,000 vaccinations. So if the details could be provided, we'd be happy to follow up and respond.
The member for Kennedy.
Minister, knife. In 6 years, all knives
No,
done
you've just said minister. There's a lot of them here. Can you just say which minister?
The one responsible for knife.
No, you've actually got to say who it is. Do you want me to go to the next question and come back?
Resources, Minister.
Thank you. Okay. We'll start the clock again. You've got your 45 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. In 6 years, all NAIF's done is extend the JCU building. Minister, you are the hero, cutting the Gordonian knot, unleashing the locomotive of prosperity. Won't your NAIF copper string initiative stop the strangulation of the Northwest Mineral Province and overcome the crippling effects of diesel generators, a tiny gas-fired power station monopoly which creates electricity costs, crushing what should be the world's greatest mineral province? Minister, with NAIF copper string, won't we build the golden pit of prosperity?
The Minister for Resources has the call.
Well, can I thank the honourable member for their question? Mr Speaker, I've heard a lot of associations with my last name, but that's a new one. Mr Speaker, I'm asked about the NAIF itself and, of course, the copper string project, which is expected to extend from Townsville to Mount Isa. It is an important project which we are taking seriously, I say to the member for Kennedy. Mr Speaker, we intend to continue to deliver for the North. We intend to continue to deliver for the people of Northern Australia, the people in the members' electorate and right across the North. But, Mr Speaker, I understand the value of the Northwest Minerals Province and the particular value that something like copper string could provide to the Northwest Minerals Province. It could generate around 750 jobs. But we've already provided, Mr Speaker, some $5 million of support in 2019 and another grant of around $11 million recently to help the proponents in terms of their design. But, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about NAIF considering the project. Now, it is inappropriate for me to comment on something completely in the NAIF's purview. However, my understanding is that they have they have an independent process, Mr Speaker. They are meeting regularly with the proponent. They will make their advice in terms of that decision and put it to me as the Minister, Mr Speaker. And I'd encourage them to continue to do that, particularly for the copper string proponents. This is a project which has been around for some time. But if it gives any comfort to the member for Kennedy, in part of the review of the NAIF, we have announced that we have got regions of growth. One of those pilot locations is from Townsville to Mount Isa as the result of a lot of lobbying from colleagues, Mr Speaker, right across the north. That is a particular area which we are focusing on as part of the work we expect to do with the NAIF. But I do have to take issue with one of the points in the question, Mr Speaker, and that is around what the NAIF has done, particularly in Queensland, how many projects it's actually supporting. It's over $1 billion in Queensland already. We know, Mr Speaker, that we have Signature on Farm, for example, out at Claremont, the Angus's, a $24 million loan for a processing facility out there, a fabulous facility, Mr Speaker. That is underway. We've seen photos of that construction.
The Minister will just pause for a second. Yeah, hang on. I'm about to call you, the member for Kennedy.
Point of order, misrepresentation. I meant before he became Minister.
No,
he's been great.
The member for Kennedy resume his seat. That really is a new one, I've got to say. The minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Metro Mining, some $47 million for a new floating terminal up north of Weipa. Of course, the North Queensland Cowboys, the new Centre of Excellence up there, some $20 million in support for a loan. James Cook University, Mater Health, Queensland Airports, Central Queensland Uni. There is a significant amount of support from the NAIF into those areas. We have made changes recently with legislation, Mr Speaker. I want the NAIF to be able to provide more money for projects of a different type. We have absolutely ensured that they can be more reactive, that they can fund projects of a different type, Mr Speaker. We want to make sure that the NAIF, and if it does eventually allocate all of the funds, Mr Speaker, it's got roughly $3 billion allocated already.
The member for McMahon and the member for Herbert can leave under 94A. That'll lower the volume.
It's already allocated almost $3 billion out of the NAIF. There's around $2 billion left in the current $5 billion facility. Mr Speaker, I'd be happy to go back to the PM if we have all of that allocated in ERC and ask for more if that's necessary.
The Minister's time has concluded. We don't want ERC in here. The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormick government is setting the foundations for our continued economic recovery from COVID-19 by investing in the safety of local community projects, particularly in my electorate of Flynn?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
You can carry on.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And from North Queensland to Central Queensland, we're talking about Queensland because Queensland is one of the powerhouses of this nation, which is going to help us recover from COVID-19. It's leading the way as far as making sure that there's agriculture, resources, growth, jobs, and I congratulate each and every Queensland member for the role that they are playing in this process, and certainly those on this side of the House, Mr Speaker. The government is spending $110 billion on infrastructure. That's supporting 100,000 workers. And in the budget, another $15.2 billion of infrastructure, and indeed that's supporting an extra 30,000 workers. And right across the nation, and particularly in Central Queensland, what an economic powerhouse, what a driver of growth that particular region is. And it's led by the member for Flynn. Indeed, the member for Capricornia has a large part to play in that, and the member for Dawson, I could go on. I think you get my drift. But, Mr Speaker, we are so proud of the fact that the resources sector is strong. Iron ore prices, $208 US per tonne today. Our agriculture, as the Minister for Agriculture will tell us, has grown $6 billion. Despite the drought, despite COVID, despite bushfires, to $66 billion, and we'll get on and make it a $100 billion sector by 2030. Our annual GDP has grown 1.1% in the March quarter. That is good news, and we should be talking that up. We should be proud of that. And as we come out of COVID-19, and hopefully that won't be too far away, but we're a long way from it yet, we are going to be having to rely on those regions, particularly Gladstone. Mr Speaker, our $100 million Gladstone Port Access Road extension, that's enabling our resources to more efficiently reach the port, to be shipped to export destinations around the world. And of course, we've invested $2.1 million in the Billawheeler heavy vehicle bypass in the member for Flynn's electorate. Now, the Mayor of Banana Shire Council, Neville Ferrier, he said this project will create up to 10 local construction jobs, supporting the council's workforce and local contractors at a time it's needed most. The bypass has been a priority here for some time, so we are proud to be working with the Australian government to make it a reality for our community. Now, our $2.5 billion investment in the local roads and community infrastructure program is driving jobs in every corner of the nation, but particularly in the electorate of Flynn, where indeed the 8 councils are receiving $54.8 million, $7 million to Banana Shire.
94A. Deputy Prime Minister can continue. Member for Macarthur can leave under Standing Order 94A. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
The list of investments in Flynn goes on and on. I could continue, but the member for Macarthur just wasted about 5 seconds of my time.
But just say to the Deputy Prime Minister he didn't actually. Well, you did have 3 whole minutes, less 6 seconds. I'd get the punchline in earlier if you're worried about that. No, it's over, so there's nothing to extend. The member for Scullin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Rory is a 42-year-old with autism. He's non-verbal and has complex mental health issues. He lives in disability group accommodation in my electorate. Rory and everyone in his group accommodation are scared because they are unvaccinated and unprotected against COVID. The government should be racing to vaccinate people in disability care. So why hasn't the Prime Minister done his job?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. And the government will continue with the various agencies and supports of the various platforms we have to distribute the vaccine, Mr Speaker, through the National Vaccination Strategy, which includes the work we do with the states and territories, which is part of the plan that was agreed back in April, Mr Speaker, saw a greater role for the states and territories in providing more platforms, more points of access for the vaccination program to reach all Australians, particularly the most vulnerable Australians. Of approximately 27,000 people with the disability in residential settings, there have been more than 10,000 doses now and more than 7,000 people have been vaccinated. That's around 25% of people in residential care have been vaccinated. That is towards the end of last month, the 29th of May. Mr Speaker, the Commonwealth InReach Vaccination Service will visit 83 disability residential accommodation sites in Victoria to vaccine vulnerable citizens. The first of the specialist disability vaccination hubs in Thomastown was established the week before last and is vaccinating more than 120 people a day, Mr Speaker. Of the broader NDIS population aged 16 years and older, Mr Speaker, 35,000 participants had been vaccinated on the most recent information I have on the 29th of May. Mr Speaker, we will continue to roll out this program to the most vulnerable Australians, in particular those who are living with disabilities. And as I've remarked in this place before, one of Australia's greatest successes during the course of COVID-19 has been that we've been able to avoid the situation where people with disabilities, and in particular those in Aboriginal communities, remote Aboriginal communities, we've been able to avoid COVID-19 having high levels of infection rates among those communities. That is a great credit to those who work with people who have disabilities, their carers, those who are working in those residential facilities, and the infection control procedures that they put in place in those facilities. And we will continue to roll out that vaccination program, Mr Speaker, as quickly and as safely as possible.
The member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government's investment incentives and tax cuts are backing Australian businesses to drive our continued economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic? And, Treasurer, are you aware of any alternatives?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Braddon for his question, acknowledge his experience as a farmer, as a soldier, Mr Speaker, and as a strong advocate for his community. I had the opportunity to join with the Prime Minister in visiting the member for Braddon's recent electorate recently. We went out to the RSL, we did an event with the local community there, we went to Blackley Irrigation, a small business that is expanding, that's taking on new people and that has used the immediate expensing provisions to buy new equipment for their business. Now, Mr Speaker, we saw in today's national accounts how the government's measures to promote immediate expensing and investment and the tax relief that we're providing the Australian community is helping to make our economy stronger. In fact, in the last 3 quarters, we have seen the economy grow by 8.7%, which is the strongest growth over the last 3 quarters that Australia has seen since 1968, Mr Speaker, the strongest economic growth in more than half a century. And as Japan and France and the United Kingdom and Germany all contracted over the course of the March quarter, the Australian economy actually expanded, Mr Speaker. It expanded. And what was particularly pleasing in the numbers today, to see what is happening to investment, dwelling investment and business investment and machinery and equipment. Now, we saw with dwelling investment, it lifted by more than 6%, the strongest result that we have seen in 17 years, Mr Speaker. We saw with business investment that increased a bit more than 3%, but importantly, machinery and equipment was up by more than 10%, the strongest result in 11 years. And what is happening through this recession and the period of recovery after it is that businesses are backing themselves. Instead of going on a capital strike, as you normally see through a recession, they're taking advantage of the immediate expensing and the loss carryback provisions that we put in the budget last year, that we extended in this year's budget, and they're actually backing themselves. They're also capitalising on the tax relief, the extension of the low and middle income tax offset. We saw in these national accounts household income increased by 1%, with more than $3 billion of tax cuts to more than 11 million people going over the course of the March quarter, Mr Speaker. And we saw more than 290,000 jobs being created over that period as well. So what we're seeing is the Australian economy capitalising on lower taxes, the Australian economy capitalising on the immediate expensing provisions, and the Australian economy delivering more jobs. There are policies, and that's why we're sticking with our plan.
The member for Maribyrnong.
Thank you. My question's to the Prime Minister. The government promised that all disability care residents will be vaccinated by last Easter. Yet yesterday, Health Department officials told Senate estimates only 355 people out of 22,000 living in disability accommodation had received both doses of vaccine. Why has the government only vaccinated less than 2% of people living in disability accommodation? Why is the Prime Minister so negligent on the vaccine rollout?
This time has concluded. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question, and I'll ask the Minister representing the Minister for the NDIS and Disabilities to add to the answer. Mr Speaker, I refer the member again to the updated figures that I've just provided regarding the provision of both first and second doses, Mr Speaker. And what is important that we understand is the Health Minister has advised on numerous occasions, Mr Speaker, numerous occasions, a first dose, Mr Speaker, is a very important protection. It's a very important protection, Mr Speaker, and I don't think it is helpful. I don't think it's helpful, Mr Speaker, for the Labor Party to be talking down first dose protections in the middle of a vaccination program.
Members on my left.
I don't think it's responsible, Mr Speaker.
Members
I don't think it's
left.
supportive of the national effort, Mr Speaker. But it is not surprising to me, Mr Speaker, that that is the way that the Labor Party would seek to act, as we have seen them act now, Mr Speaker, over these last 18 months. We will continue to focus on the job of rolling out what is the largest vaccination program in Australia's history. We have just gone through a week, Mr Speaker, which has seen more than 700,000 Australians being vaccinated around the country, and I will ask the minister to add further to the answer, Mr Speaker.
The member for Ballarat, the member for Maribyrnong was about to take a point of order, but the Prime Minister's now just asked the minister representing the Minister for the NDIS to conclude the answer. The minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. As the Prime Minister has already said, of the 27,000 Australians with a disability in residential settings, which is shared disability accommodation and residential aged care, there have been more than 10,000 doses and more than 7,000 people have been vaccinated. That is, around 25% of people in residential care have been vaccinated as of the 29th of May this year. This week alone, the Commonwealth In-Reach Vaccination Service will visit 83 disability residential accommodation sites in Victoria to vaccinate vulnerable Australians. The first of the specialist disability vaccination hubs in Thomastown was established last week and is vaccinating more than 120 people a day as part of that. And of course, as part of the broader NDIS population aged 16 and over, 35,000 participants have been vaccinated as at the 29th of May this year. At the commencement of the pandemic, the Morrison government acted swiftly to ensure the safety of participants and the viability of the sector, and will continue to do that. And the numbers speak for themselves. 183 Australians with disability have contracted COVID-19, a third of the percentage of the general population, even though as a proportion their disability and their issues in their life are so much higher. 1/3. It just goes to show the strength of what the government's response with the sector has been, and will continue to prioritise this as we move forward.
The minister's time has concluded. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister please outline to the House the global status of the coronavirus pandemic and how Australia's response is helping protect Australians and strengthen our economic recovery?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for North Sydney, particularly in his role as Chair of the House of Representatives Committee for Health and Ageing. We know that the pandemic has spread during the course of this year at a faster rate than it did last year. 446,000 cases in the last 24 hours, over 10,000 lives lost. And in particular, we know that there have been over 88 million cases this year, and the world has very sadly just passed 1.75 million lives lost in the year to date. And what that means in the year to date, in just over 5 months, we have seen more people lose their lives to COVID in 2021 than in the entire course of 2020. By comparison, Australia, through the very clear process of the rings of containment that were put in place of borders, testing, tracing, distancing and the vaccination program, has seen no lives lost from people who have caught COVID in Australia this year. We have had one who contracted it overseas, it incubated and it emerged during the course of the quarantine period. But against that world of 1.75 million lives lost globally during the course of the year, and none, thankfully, so far, although we are on watch every day, it is very important to understand what that has meant. It has meant that Australians have overwhelmingly been able to live with far greater degrees of freedom. We know that Victoria right now has an enormous challenge, and today will have been a deeply distressing day for so many Victorians. But as a country, as a nation, what we have been able to achieve has been to protect Australians and to keep Australians safe on a scale which compares with the rest of the world in a way which the rest of the world looks at it and overwhelmingly says, we wish we were in Australia's position. A country which, in a world of 88 million cases this year, of 1.75 million lives lost, has, to this point, had no person catch COVID-19 in Australia and pass from COVID-19 this year. That may not always be the case. The challenge is real, the threat is extant, and so we are deeply engaged. On the vaccine rollout program, as the Prime Minister said, we have had a record day in the last 24 hours of 133,000 vaccinations. That takes us to approximately 4.5 million vaccinations so far, and in the last 2 days alone, a record two-day figure of 252,000. So Australians are stepping forward. We've been protecting Australians, but we'll continue to protect Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, who has had the Holton report since October last year. That's 8 long months in the life of this 8-year-old government. And today Jane Holton said the government should, to quote her, should be getting on with expanded national quarantine centres as a priority. With 21 breaches of the hotel quarantine system, why does the Prime Minister still say that building a safe national quarantine system is not a race?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, first of all, the quote that the Leader of the Opposition suggested then is just completely false. I've never said that, Mr Speaker, about quarantine facilities at all, Mr Speaker. I've not said that.
Members on both sides.
The Leader of the Opposition comes to the dispatch box and basically tells complete untruths and misrepresents what I have said, Mr Speaker. I have never referred to quarantine facilities in that context at all, Mr Speaker. I haven't said that at all. And, Mr Speaker, that goes to the character of the Leader of the Opposition, and it goes to the way he comes to this dispatch box and puts these issues in the public domain.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on relevance. It's a very clear question about why this Prime Minister has not responded to the Holton report, 8 long months that recommended.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Now, it's not an opportunity to restate the question. The Prime Minister is entitled to respond to the subject matter in the question, as he's done, and I think he's doing that with the last part of the question. Obviously, he's entitled to do that, and it was a long question taking the full 30 seconds, so he's certainly in order at this point. The Prime Minister has the question.
Recommendations of the Holton report said the following: the Australian government should consider a national facility for quarantine to be used for emergency situations, emergency evacuations or urgent scalability. The government has adopted this recommendation and implemented it, Mr Speaker, at Howard Springs with a 2,000-bed facility at a cost of $500 million, Mr Speaker, and those 2,000 capacity is available now in the Northern Territory, Mr Speaker. It is available now, despite the assertions made by the Leader of the Opposition to misrepresent the facts when it comes to these issues, Mr Speaker. The recommendations of the Holton report have been fully adopted, Mr Speaker, by the government and implemented, Mr Speaker. And now, Mr Speaker, we are going further in receipt of the proposal by the Victorian government, which we are very, very close to, Mr Speaker, coming to a position which will enable us to go forward with that facility. Mr Speaker, I'll be speaking further to the Victorian the acting Premier this evening, as is part of a regular dialogue we have dealing with the many issues that are being addressed in Victoria at the moment, Mr Speaker, and we're moving forward on that issue as well. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party and the Leader of the Opposition are engaged in a daily exercise of undermining the pandemic response of this government, Mr Speaker. This has been their approach all the way through this pandemic. This is a Labor Party and a Leader of the Opposition that Australia can't rely on, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister, I can't take another point of order on relevance, but I was about to just say to the Prime Minister, whilst he was entitled at the start to respond to what was a direct accusation in the question, I allowed him to do that. He then now needs to remain relevant to the question. If he wishes to give a character assessment of those opposite, there are many ways he can do that, but not in answer to this question. The Prime Minister has concluded. Okay. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's defence cooperation with allies and partners is setting the foundation for our continued economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question and greatly appreciate her support of our Defence Force personnel. Mr Speaker, every Australian would be proud of the work that is about to get underway in exercise Talisman Sabre, predominantly in Queensland, where we'll see 1,800 troops travel to our country for the exercise. They'll come not only from the United States, but also from Canada, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand and the United Kingdom. And this will be a very significant effort for us to work very closely with our partners. And Mr Speaker, this government has put $270 billion into defence capability over this decade, and we know that Labor withdrew $18 billion from the Defence Force when they were last in government because they lost control of their borders and they needed to put that money, Mr Speaker, into that policy failure. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about alternative policies, and
members on my left,
as the Australian public knows of this Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, right through the course of the way in which we have responded to the COVID pandemic, and I'm asked about the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr Speaker, this individual, Mr Speaker, this Leader of the Opposition has sought to undermine our standing as a country from day one when it comes to the vaccine rollout, Mr Speaker.
Minister for Defence will resume his seat. I'd like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to resume his seat at this point and point out, as I did in the last few question times, that when ministers are asked about alternative approaches, that really is a way in the standing orders to talk about alternative policies. In fact, the standing orders make clear that questions cannot ask directly about opposition policies, which is why that tag phrase has existed for a very long time. But I have tightened up on it. Just because you're asked about alternative approaches does not mean that you can embark on a character assessment. You're going to need to actually find an alternative policy approach that you can refer to that's relevant to the question that's been asked. And I'd just say, I mean, it's not curtailing debate. There are other forms of the House for exactly the sort of approach the minister was taking, and they're very open to him, but it's just not open in question time if it's not relevant to the question.
So that, Mr Speaker, I'm just coming to the Labor policy right now. And, Mr Speaker, their policy in relation to defence, as we've seen on display by the Leader of the Opposition today, is not in our national interest. Is not in our national interest, Mr Speaker. At a time when our partners are coming together, at a time when our partners understand the intelligence and the threats within our region, the Leader of the Opposition is out there seeking to undermine the position of this country, Mr Speaker. That is the Labor policy.
No, he has to.
That is the Labor policy.
No, the minister will not argue with me. Members on my left, particularly those behind the front bench, are assisting no one. The minister's asked if there are alternative approaches. He needs to say what they are, not say what they are and say what the consequences are. The minister has the call. If you're asked about alternative approaches or policies, you've at least got to say what they are. I don't think that's an overly stringent requirement.
Well, Mr Speaker, just to put
the
it
member
into
for Chifley will leave under 94A.
To put it into clear words, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is enunciating a policy of the Labor Party at the moment, which is an alternative policy, in contrast to the government's policy. That is, we are standing up for our country's interests. You are not. No,
the Minister
Party,
for Defence.
Mr Speaker.
No, the Minister for Defence. Members on my left.
Mr Speaker, the government at the moment.
I've asked the minister to pause yet a second time. I think I've made my ruling clear. If the minister wants to say what he's saying, he can't do it in response to this question. and we can do this the long way or the short way, but he really can't. Let me be really clear about it. If he wants to launch the sort of character attack he's doing, I have tightened up on this and I've made it very clear, and other ministers have given very robust answers by saying this is the alternative approach, this is the alternative policy. If he wants to go down the path he's going, he really has to use another form of the House, like a suspension. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I understand your ruling, and I've been very clear about the government's position and our policy, and that is one of consistency in relation to support of our Defence Forces. We have put money into the Australian Defence Force, Mr Speaker, at an unprecedented level. We have put $270 billion in over the course of this decade, Mr Speaker. We are realistic about the threats that our country faces, and this government, Mr Speaker, isn't saying one thing to one group and then completely the opposite to the next group, Mr Speaker. That is the contrast between this side and that side of the Parliament.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware the Business Council of Australia chief said on the weekend, and I quote, "Victorians are being plunged into despair and disbelief again by a failure to get the basics right, including our quarantine system. Australia's businesses know a safe national quarantine system will better protect them. So why won't the Prime Minister just do his job and deliver it?"
Yeah. The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And in relation to the Shadow Minister's question, the first thing is that when we look at that comparison with the rest of the world, which I outlined previously, what that does show is that of all the countries in the world, at a time when we are seeing outbreaks in Thailand, in Singapore, in South Korea, Japan, in the jurisdiction of Taiwan, we see that the situation in Australia is...
leave under 94A.
We see that the situation in Australia is vastly different. The central, the first line, the most fundamental of all of the protections is the quarantine system, but it was always the first line, not the last line of defence, the first ring of containment where others are in place. And that's been recognised right throughout: borders, testing, tracing, distancing and vaccination. Now, when we look at the situation, as the Prime Minister has said, with well over 300,000 Australians having come back through hotel quarantine and the circumstances of over 99.99% effectiveness, we know that any country that engages with the rest of the world is at risk of incursions. No country has an immunity, but no country is perhaps better protected than Australia. Having said that, there are very clear hotel quarantine guidelines that have been put in place that have protected Australia. Firstly, we have the decision of the National Cabinet on the 27th of March of 2020, which also included the Australian Defence Force will begin assisting state and territory governments to undertake quarantine compliance. But there has been ongoing work. Reference has been made to the Holton Review, and on the 23rd of October, National Cabinet accepted this review's recommendations. On the 24th of December, very importantly, the medical expert panel, the AHPPC, agreed on the ongoing national principles for hotel quarantine and noted that as state and territory governments manage hotel quarantine, many of these recommendations are implemented locally. And they have that role and they have that responsibility, and they've been overwhelmingly doing it to the highest of standards. The Commonwealth has put in place, in line with the recommendation of the Holton Review, the National Resilience Centre at Howard Springs. That has now been adopted by the Northern Territory as its responsibility, but we have seen its expansion in capacity, and I would note that we see flights on the current intended schedule which have come in on the 23rd, 24th, 25th and 31st of May. We have flights which are expected, subject to final confirmation, on the 10th of June, the 16th of June, the 20th of June, the 21st of June, the 23rd of June, the 24th of June, the 30th of June. These are the people who are coming in to be cared for, protected and quarantined in Australia, that indeed make up the very numbers to which the Leader of the Opposition was referring.
Time has concluded. And I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House about how the Morrison government's actions to strengthen our border protection is setting the foundation for our continued economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic by creating a safer and more secure Australia? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
I thank the member for his question and for his very strong interest in national security. Our government makes absolutely no apologies for doing what needs to be done to keep Australians safe and secure. And the security of our borders and the safety of our families and our businesses are absolutely critical to our continued economic recovery. We were swift to act at the start of the pandemic, and it's widely recognised that our international border controls have played a major role in Australia's successful containment of the virus. Now, as the Prime Minister has said, our international borders will only open when it's safe to do so. But I want to assure the Australian people that we are carefully planning for the future and working on ways to facilitate a safe reopening based on medical advice and our capacity to manage increased arrivals. We know that border restrictions that have been necessary during the pandemic have had a significant impact on many Australians, particularly those who are wanting to be reunited with loved ones. But strong borders are essential at this time, and of course the coalition government has a strong track record on border security. Now, one of the first things that I did when I was sworn in as the Minister for Home Affairs was send a very clear message that our government remains absolutely determined when it comes to border policy, so that people smugglers don't think that they can start back up their evil trade. Secure borders are now more important than ever, and the risk of uncontrolled arrivals to our shores at this time is more significant than ever before. Now, through Operation Sovereign Borders, which we are continuing to fund through the budget, we have achieved what others said was impossible. And next month it will be 7 years since the last successful people smuggling venture reached our shores. Turnbacks continue to work, with 873 people from 38 people smuggling boats returned to their country of departure or to their home country. Now, it is a matter of fact that more than 1,200 people drowned at sea and more than 50,000 people arrived illegally in Australia under the Labor government, and this government will never allow that to happen. Our government remains absolutely laser-focused on the national interest, on protecting our sovereignty and on keeping the Australian community safe.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister understand that today Victorians are dealing with the impacts of an extended lockdown, including the closure of schools, disruption to small businesses without JobKeeper, concern about vulnerable loved ones in aged care and ongoing mental health impacts? Prime Minister, wouldn't this have been avoided if, instead of insisting it's not a race, you'd simply done your job? Why should Victorians be punished for your negligence?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have greater faith in the people of Victoria than what has been suggested, Mr Speaker, by the assertions from the member. Mr Speaker, Australians understand, whether they're in Victoria or anywhere else, Mr Speaker, that we are combating a virus that is insidious, and they know—
The member for Wills will leave under Standing Order 94A. I again just remind people of what will automatically happen if they continue to interject in the way they have been. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. They understand that the job of our government has been to do two things: to save lives and to save livelihoods, Mr Speaker. And in this country, Mr Speaker, the interjection, I note, Mr Speaker, it says, when is that going to start? It may have escaped the member that in this country, Mr Speaker, had we had the same death rate from COVID as the average of the OECD, more than 30,000 people would have lost their lives, Mr Speaker. And here in this country, Mr Speaker, that is not what occurred. That is not what occurred here in this country, Mr Speaker. Now, in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, it has been our job to save livelihoods as well. And as the national accounts demonstrate today, and as the national employment figures demonstrate, Mr Speaker, today, there are more people in work today than there were before the pandemic, and our economy is bigger today, Mr Speaker, than it was before the pandemic began. Now, those opposite, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party may seek to undermine the government's efforts and talk down Australia, but what I know is Victorians face this challenge. They'll face it, Mr Speaker, with the same strength and the same resilience as all Australians have, Mr Speaker, all around this country. And this government will continue to provide support, Mr Speaker, as we have in the past and as we continue to do even now, Mr Speaker. Emergency cash assistance, pandemic leave payments, the job seeker payments, the relaxation of the work activity test, Mr Speaker, and the income arrangements, Mr Speaker, that apply to these payments and waiting lists, all provided. And I'm speaking further again today to the acting Premier, as the Treasurer is also speaking to the Treasurer in Victoria. Those opposite, Mr Speaker, may want to use the pandemic for their political purposes. We'll keep doing our job, saving Australian lives, saving Australian livelihoods.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister outline to the House how the decisive action the Morrison government is taking to boost our fuel security is helping to set the foundation of our continued economic recovery from COVID-19 by ensuring Australians have access to the affordable, reliable and secure energy we rely on? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for O'Connor for his question. And as a proud farmer and regional member, he knows the importance of energy security for keeping the economy moving in his electorate and right across Australia, Mr Speaker. And he knows that the truckies, the tradies, the farmers, the miners in places like Collie and the goldfields absolutely rely on energy security and liquid fuel security to be able to do their jobs every day, Mr Speaker. Now, while Australia's fuel supplies have remained secure and affordable through the pandemic, we need to be vigilant. We need to be vigilant, Mr Speaker, in the event of the worst-case scenarios that might come upon us. Now, our fuel security package is focused on dealing with exactly that, Mr Speaker, and it has a number of components. The first is a minimum stock obligation, which will require a 40% increase in diesel stock holdings onshore here in Australia. We're investing, of course, in onshore diesel storage, Mr Speaker, to make sure that there are the storages there for that additional diesel holding. But we've also locked in the future of our refineries, Mr Speaker. The refinery in Geelong, and the refinery in Brisbane. And those refineries are not just secured for the future, Mr Speaker, they're secured for investment to make our fuel cleaner, Mr Speaker. That's all part of the package.
The member for Kingsford Smith will leave under 94A.
That will, Mr Speaker, ensure that we have the sovereign capability, the self-sufficiency when we really need it. And that builds on the broader work we're doing on energy security right across the country to make sure we have the supplies of generation of electricity energy when we really need it, Mr Speaker. We're ensuring that Australians have what they need. Now, I was asked about alternative approaches, and there are at least two, Mr Speaker. On the one hand, there's the member for Hunter and his Otis Group mates. On the other hand, there's a group the member for Hunter has called the excessive progressives, Mr Speaker. The excessive progressives.
The minister better come quickly to what the alternative is, not giving us, another clip that he's read in the newspaper. He's got to come to what the alternative is.
It's a very important question. What are the policies of the excessive progressives, who we are told are on the march, Mr Speaker? On the march? Well, we know they're against natural gas. We know they're against jobs in the Hunter Valley, Mr Speaker.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr Speaker. On on relevance. If he wants to talk about alternatives, he can talk about the 2 refineries that have shut on
The
his watch.
Leader of the Opposition will
2 out of
resume
4.
his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Minister has the call. That is not a valid
Mr.
point
Speaker,
of
I'm
order.
not going to talk about Clyde and Canal that closed when the Leader of the Opposition was the Transport Minister, Mr. Speaker, but I will talk about the policies of those opposite, including shutting down jobs in the Hunter Valley, opposing clean technology jobs through reforms of ARENA and opposing additional investment in ARENA, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with the job of energy security and fuel security. Those opposite are
The Minister's
opposing.
time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask, does the Prime Minister take any responsibility for the ongoing lockdown in Victoria?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, as the Leader of the Opposition would be fully aware, the decisions to implement lockdowns in states and territories around the country are solely and totally the responsibility of state and territory governments. Solely and totally, Mr. Speaker. Commonwealth Government is not part of that decision-making process. They are made by state governments, in this case the Victorian State Government, Mr. Speaker. But despite that, the Commonwealth Government seeks to work closely with the state government, Mr. Speaker, as we have been doing, particularly in relation to the extension of further support through the ADF to support the measures that they have requested. And I'm having further discussions with the Acting Premier this evening, as the Treasurer is having with the Treasurer in Victoria, Mr. Speaker. But lockdowns in states are decisions of state and territory governments. Mr. Speaker, that, Mr. Speaker, is a responsibility that the states and territories have jealously guarded over the course of the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is their responsibility, and they are making those decisions and taking those responsibilities, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister inform the House about how the Morrison-McCormack government's actions in securing our strong mineral export markets is setting the foundation for our continued economic recovery from COVID-19 pandemic by creating a safer and more secure Australia? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Resources.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for their question? And it's Minerals Week, Mr. Speaker, and we need to be out there supporting our hard-working men and women in the resources sector, and I'm sure the member for Cowper does. But why is the minerals sector so important to the member's electorate and so important to all Australians, Mr. Speaker? How is it that it makes a safer and more secure Australia? Well, the reality is pretty straightforward. In the world of changing technology, Mr. Speaker, as we continue to look at electrification, whether it's defence, new medical applications, smart tech, communications, it is Australia's resources sector that is providing that feedstock. Now, Mr. Speaker, critical minerals, rare earths, are actually used in defence assets. An F-35 fighter, for example, contains 417 kilos of rare earths. It's used in targeting, communications and other systems. A destroyer, Mr. Speaker, has nearly 2.5 tonne of rare earths. A submarine might have more than 4 tonne of rare earths. Mr. Speaker, a smartphone, I'm sure there's a lot of people in here who use a smartphone, Mr. Speaker, more than 40 different mine minerals and more than 20 to 40 grams of cobalt. So, Mr. Speaker, the minerals sector is important for all Australians. It is important we have a strong sector in the resources sector. It's important we continue to look for opportunities, particularly for downstream processing. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Minerals Council has put out a forecast on the increase for demand of the minerals sector. And we expect things like aluminium, for example, in terms of a processed product, up by 45% by 2030, the global demand for nickel to rise by 67%, and of course iron ore and all of our other staples to remain strong and continue to employ Australians right across the board, some 260,000 individuals, Mr. Speaker. Now, we are intending to ensure that that pipeline continues, that we continue to have that employment opportunity. $20 million in the budget committed to the Global Resources Strategy, over $200 million exploring for the future, future to ensure we do have that pipeline and new projects and new mines coming on. We intend to ensure, and we have done, through the GEMI, the General Minerals Exploration Incentive, tax incentive, Mr Speaker, to make sure we are out there working hard in those regional areas, delivering new opportunities for mines and miners. But, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about alternatives. And, Mr Speaker, we saw an alternative from those opposite reported today on their approach to the resources sector. And, Mr Speaker, that particular project is likely to deliver some 6,000 jobs into the Northern Territory over the next 20 years. Some 6,000 jobs. And how do those opposite approach this? They have to put it to a vote in their caucus to decide if they support the resources sector, Mr Speaker. That is the approach of those opposite. We stand up for our sector unequivocally. We stand up for those jobs, Mr Speaker. We know, Mr Speaker, that projects like those in Narrabri, like those in the Barossa, like those in Scarborough, they don't need to be put for a vote. We support them 100%.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House 1 notes A. The Australian Government is responsible for the funding and regulation of aged care. B. More than 1/3 of aged care residents are yet to be fully vaccinated with 2 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine. C. The government does not know how many residential aged care staff have been vaccinated against COVID-19. D. The aged care minister says he's comfortable with the pace of the vaccine rollout, and the Prime Minister says vaccinating Australians is not a race. E. The states have now been forced to step in to fix the Prime Minister's bungled vaccine rollout in aged care and disability care. F. The Constitution provides the Australian Government is responsible for quarantine. And G. Despite the fact there have been 21 breaches of hotel quarantine and the Prime Minister has had the Holton report since October last year, the Prime Minister has failed to establish a safe national quarantine system, and 2, therefore calls on the Prime Minister to urgently fix his bungled vaccine rollout and establish a safe national quarantine system.
Is leave granted? The Leader of the House.
Leave is not granted.
The Leader of the Opposition. Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I move that so much of standing orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition moving the following motion immediately. That the House 1 notes A. The Australian Government is responsible for the funding and regulation of aged care. B. More than 1/3 of aged care residents are yet to be fully vaccinated with 2 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine. C. The government does not know how many residential aged care staff have been vaccinated against COVID-19. D. The aged care minister says he's comfortable with the pace of the vaccine rollout, and the Prime Minister says vaccinating Australians is not a race. E. The states have now been forced to step in to fix the Prime Minister's bungled vaccine rollout in aged care and disability care. F. The Constitution provides the Australian Government is responsible for quarantine. And G. Despite the fact there have been 21 breaches of hotel quarantine and the Prime Minister has had the Holton report since October last year, the Prime Minister has failed to establish a safe national quarantine system, and 2, therefore calls on the Prime Minister to urgently fix his bungled vaccine rollout and establish a safe national quarantine system. This Prime Minister won't accept responsibility for anything. He said he doesn't hold up.
The Leader of the House has the call. The Leader of the House has the call.
Mr Speaker, I move the member be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.
I'm just resting my voice.
Lock the doors. The question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Gray and Nichols. Tellers for the ayes and the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa. Tellers for the noes. Don't smile too much. You're not meant to leave your seat during a division. Order. We have the result of the division. The result of the division is ayes 68, noes 58. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Seconded. The Victoria is in lockdown because this Prime Minister is incompetent and negligent.
The Leader of the House is the call.
Mr Speaker, I move the member be no longer heard.
The question is the Deputy Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats in this successive division unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the last division, in which case they need to report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 68, noes 58. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be disagreed to. The Leader of the House, I just need to point out, to move the motion he wants to move, I at least need to hear something, okay? So the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Take your seat.
2 jobs, vaccines and quarantine, and he's failed at both.
The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Leader of the House has...
Mr Speaker, I move the motion be put.
The question is the motion be put. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. If the ayes have it, division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Once again, in this successive division, members need to remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the last division, in which case they need to report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 68, noes 58. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition be disagreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. I think the ayes have it. No. Division required. I ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. In this successive division, I appoint the same tellers. Once again, members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the last division, in which case they need to indicate to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 68, noes 59. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The Minister for Health had indicated to me he wished to add to an answer. The Minister for
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I am very pleased to add to an earlier answer. I have been advised very recently by the Vaccine Operations Centre that they have upgraded by 5,000 the number of Australians vaccinated in the last 24 hours. Instead of 133,000, it is 138,705, a record number.